Alex Carter sat in his penthouse, high above the city of Boston, a man surrounded by glass, steel, and silence. From the wide windows, the Charles River reflected the early winter sky, a restless ribbon of gray-blue, and beyond it the city lights blinked like countless stars scattered at his feet. The view was magnificent, the kind of view realtors bragged about, the kind of view only money could buy. But to Alex, it felt more like a painting nailed to the wall of a museum. Impressive, admired by others, but utterly lifeless to the man standing in front of it. At 48, Alex was the sort of man whose name appeared in business journals and Sunday talk shows. He was the face of Carter Holdings, a sprawling empire of hotels, restaurants, office towers, and luxury housing developments. In a boardroom, his voice could tilt markets. At a dinner table, a single nod could close deals worth more than most families would see in 100 lifetimes. But tonight, in the stillness of his penthouse at 1 Dalton Street, none of it mattered. The only sound was the steady tick of the grandfather clock he had inherited from his grandmother, a sound he had once found comforting but now heard as a reminder of how empty the hours had become. He poured himself a glass of water and stared at his reflection in the window. The man staring back was impeccably dressed, his tailored suit flawless, his tie a silk knot of power and precision. But under the sharp lines of his jaw and the faint silver at his temples, Alex saw only fatigue. Wealth had wrapped itself around him like armor, but armor was heavy. The truth was that he felt profoundly alone. It was not the first time he had felt this way, and not the first time he had decided to do something about it. Alex had a ritual, one he had never shared with anyone except his most trusted associate. Every few months, when the weight of his empire grew unbearable, he shed the identity of Alexander Carter, billionaire, and slipped into a disguise that made him invisible. He would trade his suit for a thrift store jacket, polish for stubble, privilege for anonymity. In that role, he wasn't a CEO or a man worth billions. He was just another face in the crowd, another soul trying to get by. Tonight he reached into the back of his closet and pulled out the old costume. A gray corduroy jacket with worn elbow patches, jeans that had faded with age, and scuffed boots that pinched slightly at the heel. He added a plaid flannel shirt, one that reminded him of the small Ohio town where he had grown up, where men wore shirts like this to Sunday suppers and town fairs. He placed a wool cap on his head and studied the transformation in the mirror. The man who looked back was no titan of industry. He was a stranger who might be struggling to pay next month's rent. For Alex, that anonymity was not humiliation, it was relief. Outside, the November wind carried the crisp bite of approaching winter. On the streets of Back Bay, shop windows glowed with wreaths and holiday garlands. A busker on Boylston Street played a harmonica, the notes tumbling through the cold air, and the smell of roasted chestnuts drifted from a vendor's cart. Boston was preparing for Thanksgiving, only days away now, and the sidewalks buzzed with families carrying bags of groceries and decorations. Alex walked among them, unnoticed, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, breathing in the sharp air, as if to cleanse himself of the sterile luxury he had left behind. His destination was the Gilded Steer, the most celebrated restaurant in his empire. Magazine covers described it as Boston's crown jewel, a place where senators, celebrities, and CEOs dined under chandeliers and left 5-figure tabs without blinking. Alex had read the glowing reviews, the financial reports that boasted record-breaking revenue, the staff evaluations that painted the place as flawless. But Alex had long since stopped believing in numbers and press releases. Reports could tell him profit margins, but they couldn't tell him if the soul of the restaurant was intact. He needed to see for himself. He reached the heavy brass doors and pulled one open. Warmth rushed out to meet him, carrying with it the aroma of charred steaks and fine wine, mingled with the scent of expensive perfume and leather banquettes. Inside, the dining room gleamed with polished wood and golden light. Fires crackled in the hearths, while waiters in crisp uniforms moved with rehearsed precision. Laughter floated above the low hum of conversation, punctuated by the clink of crystal glasses. The hostess, tall and statuesque with hair perfectly arranged, looked up from her stand. Her smile was dazzling. But when her eyes swept over Alex's thrift store jacket and worn boots, the brilliance faltered. "Good evening, sir," she said smoothly, though her tone carried a faint edge of disbelief. "Do you have a reservation?" She lingered on the word reservation as though to remind him that such places were not for men like him. Alex met her gaze calmly. lowering his voice into a rougher register, one stripped of authority. "Number, just one. A table for one." Her manicured fingers tapped against the tablet on the stand. "We are fully booked tonight," she said, pausing dramatically. "But let me see what I can do." The exaggerated patience in her voice was a performance, one designed to tell him his presence was an inconvenience. Finally, she looked up, lips tight. "We can seat you near the kitchen entrance. It's the only thing available." "Perfect," Alex said, masking the wry amusement that flickered in him. He followed her across the dining room, past rows of patrons in tailored suits and glittering gowns. Conversations hushed briefly as eyes tracked the anomaly. A man in shabby clothes walking through a garden of wealth. He felt their curiosity and disdain like heat on his skin. The hostess stopped at a small, wobbly table tucked against the swinging doors of the kitchen. Plates and voices rattled on the other side, the doors slamming open and shut with every tray. She set down a single menu, her smile stiff. "Your server will be with you shortly." Alex sat and folded his hands, surveying the room from the worst seat in the house. It was, in truth, exactly what he wanted. From here, he could see it all: the waiters whose smiles widened when they approached wealthy tables, the manager whose laughter was just a shade too loud, the carefully choreographed dance of service that was flawless in efficiency but barren of soul. He lifted his water glass and let the cool condensation dampen his fingertips. A sigh escaped him. Was this what his empire had built? Gleaming surfaces and hollow gestures? A world where worth was measured not in character but in the cut of a suit? For a fleeting moment, Alex thought of his younger self, the boy who had once dreamed of becoming an architect, of designing homes where families would grow together. Somewhere along the way, that boy had been lost. And then, across the room, he saw her. She moved differently from the others, less polished, perhaps, but more human. A young waitress, no older than her mid-20s, with chestnut brown hair pulled back in a plain ponytail. Her uniform was tidy but worn, her shoes cracked at the seams from long hours. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes, as though sleep had been a luxury she could rarely afford. Yet when she approached his table, there was no calculation in her smile, no polished performance. It was a smile that carried warmth, tired though she was. For a moment, the clamor of the restaurant faded. Alex lifted his gaze, and under the glow of the chandeliers, their eyes met. Hers were brown and wide, touched with weariness, but unclouded by judgment. They did not weigh his worth or measure his appearance. They simply saw him. Emily walked toward the table, carrying herself with quiet grace. And then, at last, she smiled warmly, sincerely, without a trace of pretense. The bustle of the gilded steer continued around Alex. Silver trays flashing in the lamplight, the aroma of dry-aged beef filling the air. But his focus had narrowed to the young waitress who now stood at his table. She introduced herself with a soft, steady voice. "Good evening, sir. My name is Emily, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." The words were practiced, the same script spoken by servers in 1,000 restaurants across the country. Yet there was something about her tone, something unpolished and genuine, that made the words sound like more than courtesy. Emily Johnson was 24, though the weight on her shoulders often made her seem older. She balanced the tray on her palm with grace, but her eyes betrayed the fatigue of long shifts and sleepless nights. When she set down a basket of bread, Alex noticed the faint tremor in her hand, as if nerves and exhaustion had worked themselves into her very bones. "Would you like to start with something to drink?" she asked. Alex looked at her name tag, then at her eyes. He could have ordered the finest wine on the list. Instead, he said evenly, "A glass of your cheapest beer." There was no flicker of disapproval, no tightening of her smile. She simply nodded, as though the request were as natural as ordering sparkling water. "Of course, I'll be right back." Alex watched her leave, his gaze dropping to her shoes. Black, non-slip, standard for restaurant work. But the soles were nearly flat from wear, the leather cracked. He thought of the endless hours they must have carried her, the wages that likely never stretched far enough for replacements. It was a small detail, yet it told a story numbers never could. Across the dining room, the restaurant's manager hovered like a hawk. Gregory Finch was in his 40s, dark-haired, his suit cut a little too tight across the middle. He laughed boisterously with a table of businessmen, clapping one on the back as if they were old friends. But the moment he turned away, the smile vanished, replaced by eyes sharp and watchful. He barked a quiet order at a busboy, who scurried off in haste. Finch's gaze swept the room and lingered on Emily. There was something in the way he watched her ownership, calculation. Alex made a note of it in the back of his mind. He had learned long ago that power revealed itself not in how people treated their equals, but in how they treated the ones beneath them. Emily returned with a beer, setting it gently before him. Foam slid down the glass, leaving a trail. "Enjoy, sir." "Thank you," Alex said. Her smile warmed, just for a moment. Then she moved on, weaving through the maze of tables with the practiced steps of someone who had danced this floor many nights. Behind that smile, however, Emily's thoughts churned. Every night at the Gilded Steer was the same performance. Polite greetings, careful posture, memorized lines about specials and wine pairings. But behind the curtain, her life was far from rehearsed. Her apartment in Dorchester was small and drafty, with peeling paint and a heater that rattled like an old train. Yet it was home. And in that home was the reason she endured all of it, her 6-year-old son, Daniel. To Emily, he was everything. She worked double shifts and skipped meals so that Danny could have medicine, so that he could see doctors, so that he might one day play in the park without the constant shadow of illness. His congenital heart condition was a cruel twist of fate, an endless cycle of appointments and bills that no insurance would ever fully cover. Every tip she earned at the Gilded Steer went not to luxuries, but to survival. Gregory Finch knew that, and he used it. It had begun months earlier, with a small mistake, an inventory entry Emily had logged wrong after a 16-hour shift. The error was trivial, the kind that could be fixed in minutes. But Finch had seized on it, accusing her of theft, inflating the discrepancy into thousands of dollars. Cornering her in his office, he had lowered his voice until it was a hiss. "You'll never work in this city again if I report this. No fine restaurant will touch you. You'll lose this job. And what will happen to your boy then?" Emily had stood frozen, her heart pounding. She wanted to scream, to fight, to prove her innocence. But Finch knew about Danny. He always mentioned him, twisting the knife deeper. His offer had been simple: work harder, give up a cut of her pay, and help him with his records late at night. If she refused, he would ruin her. And so, exhausted and trapped, Emily had done as he asked. She had adjusted invoices under his direction, reconciling numbers she knew were wrong. Each time, shame burned in her chest. Each time, she thought of Danny and forced herself to go on. Now, as she stood in the glow of chandeliers, balancing trays and smiling at strangers, the weight of Finch's threat pressed on her like a stone. She felt it when she carried plates, when she poured wine, when she heard the squeak of her worn shoes. It was always there, lurking. Still, there were lines she would not cross. She could not bring herself to treat people as Finch did, measuring them only by their wallets. That was why, when she approached Alex Carter's shabby table, she had treated him with the same dignity she gave to a senator at table 5. She didn't know who he was, didn't know the fortune behind the thrift store jacket. She only knew he was a customer, a human being, and he deserved respect. Across the room, Finch's eyes narrowed. He watched Emily as she refilled Alex's water, her voice calm, her manner steady. Something about it annoyed him, though he couldn't have said why. He shifted his gaze toward the kitchen, then back to her, like a predator circling prey. Alex noticed. He had spent years reading people, years recognizing subtle shifts in posture and tone that revealed more than words ever could. He saw the tension in Emily's shoulders when Finch passed by, the way her smile faltered only for a heartbeat before returning. He didn't know the details yet, but he knew this: there was fear there. And fear always had a cause. Later that night, after the dining room emptied, Emily would return to her apartment. She would let herself in quietly, careful not to wake Danny, who often slept on the worn couch with a blanket pulled to his chin. She would tuck him in, brush the hair from his forehead, and whisper, "Hang in there, baby, Mommy's got you." He never heard her, but saying it kept her going. For now, though, she carried on with the show, balancing trays, smiling at patrons, pretending she wasn't being watched. Her path took her past Alex's table again, and for just a moment, their eyes met once more. There was a flicker there, a faint, desperate glimmer before she quickly looked away. Emily glanced across the room where Gregory Finch stood with his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her like a shadow she could never outrun. She knew he was watching, knew that every move she made could cost her more than just her job. She looked back at Alex Carter, sitting quietly in his faded jacket, and for a split second, hope stirred in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, he was the only one who might see the truth. Emily looked across the room at Alex, her eyes shining with a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Tired, yes, but also a spark of defiance, of hope. He saw it and leaned slightly forward, as though bracing for what might come. The night moved forward, and Alex lingered at his table as the dining room filled with a low, steady hum. Glasses clinked, forks tapped against porcelain, and the steady rhythm of service rolled on like a carefully rehearsed play. But at this shabby table near the kitchen doors, the play was beginning to fracture. Emily passed by again, her tray balanced with the ease of repetition. Yet her eyes were never entirely at peace. She glanced toward the manager's station more than once, as if checking for danger. Alex noticed. Years of reading markets, contracts, and faces had trained him to catch the smallest tells. Something about the young woman's tension, how her smile dimmed slightly when the manager appeared, how her hand trembled when she poured wine, suggested a storm behind the curtain. When she returned to his table, Alex set down his menu deliberately. "I'll have the Emperor's cut," he said. His tone was calm, almost casual. Emily blinked. The Emperor's cut was the most extravagant item on the menu, a 48-ounce porterhouse, dry-aged 90 days, paired with a truffle reduction. It was a spectacle, priced at $500, a dish designed for corporate accounts and special celebrations, never for a man in a faded flannel shirt. Her eyes flicked to his scuffed boots, then back to his steady gaze. For a moment, she wondered if this was some kind of cruel joke, or perhaps a misunderstanding. But in his eyes, she found no arrogance, no bravado, only a quiet challenge, a kind of stillness that unsettled her. "An excellent choice, sir," she said at last, her voice steady despite the pulse racing in her chest. "How would you like it prepared?" "Medium rare," Alex replied. "And a glass of your 1,998 Cheval Blanc." That nearly stopped her heart. Even by the glass, it was a $300 pour. For a single man at the worst table in the house, the order was absurd. If Finch discovered this, Emily knew what would follow: accusations, threats, perhaps worse. She should have gone to the manager immediately to demand a credit card, as the rules required. But something about the way Alex looked at her, calm, respectful, entirely without mockery, stilled her. Against reason, against fear, she nodded. "Right away, sir." When she keyed the order into the system, the alert pinged almost instantly at Finch's desk. She felt the heat of his gaze before she heard his footsteps. He intercepted her near the wine station, his body blocking her path. "What are you thinking, Vance?" he hissed, his voice a low snarl. "Table 32 just ordered the Emperor's cut and a 2098 Cheval Blanc. Did you even look at him? He looks like he wandered in from the street." Emily's pulse hammered. "I didn't want to insult a guest, sir," she whispered. "Insult?" Finch sneered, his face close enough that she could smell stale coffee on his breath. "When he dines and dashes, that's coming out of your check. Every cent of it." His eyes narrowed. "You're already on thin ice with me, Emily. Don't make me push you off." She stood, frozen, fear clawing up her throat. But then, as if sensing her terror, she felt eyes on her. She turned slightly and saw Alex watching from his table, his expression unreadable, his posture calm. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see everything. Finch's looming figure, Emily's flinching shoulders. And then Alex did something small, almost imperceptible. He nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of acknowledgement. Emily's breath caught. For the first time in months, she felt less alone. "I'll take responsibility," she said softly, her voice steadier than before. Finch glared at her another second, then stalked off, muttering. Emily exhaled shakily and made her way to the wine cellar. She handled the vintage with reverence, extracting the pour with perfect care. When she set it before Alex, her hands were steady again. "Your Cheval Blanc's here." Alex lifted the glass, swirling the ruby liquid. He didn't drink it once. He looked at her. "Is everything all right, Emily?" Your manager seemed agitated. Her professional mask snapped back into place. "Everything's fine, sir. He's just very passionate about standards." Alex took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving hers. "I have a feeling you have higher standards than he does." The words pierced straight through her defenses. She drew in a breath, said nothing, and turned away before the heat of tears could rise in her eyes. The rest of the meal passed in a quiet current of unspoken understanding. Alex ate slowly, deliberately, asking her occasional questions about the city, the neighborhoods, the people. Unlike other guests, he listened to her answers. He seemed more interested in the life beyond the chandeliers than the performance within them. And Emily, though cautious, felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. By the time dessert orders began to taper off and the dining room thinned, she had made a decision. It was reckless, maybe even dangerous, but it was the only path left. Finch had trapped her with his fabricated debt, forcing her into silence. But here, sitting at table 32, was a man who might be able to help not because of money, but because of the way he watched, the way he understood without words. If she could pass him a message, if she could take the risk, maybe her nightmare could end. She slipped into the break room during a lull, her hands trembling as she pulled a linen napkin from the stack. She gripped a pen so tightly her knuckles whitened. What could she write? "Help me?" Too desperate. "My boss is a crook?" Too small. She needed something larger, something undeniable. She thought of the forged invoices Finch made her reconcile, the shell companies, the poisoned supply chain. Her hand shook as she scrawled the words. "They're watching you. The kitchen is not safe. Check the ledger in Finch's office. He's poisoning the supply chain." She folded the napkin tight and pressed it into her apron pocket. The weight of it felt like holding fire. When Alex finished his coffee and left payment exact to the cent, she knew the moment had come. She cleared the table with practiced motions, her right hand lifting the bill tray, her left hand slipping the folded napkin onto the polished wood and covering it in one swift motion. The sleight of hand took less than a second, but Alex's eyes were sharp. He noticed. "Wait," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the hum of the room. Emily froze. Panic surged in her chest. Had she been too obvious? Was he about to expose her? Slowly, she turned back. He was not looking at her now, but at the empty place where the tray had been. He had seen her hesitation, seen the napkin, hidden and taken back. For an instant, confusion and disappointment flickered across his face. Emily's heart thundered. She had made a mess of it, been too clever for her own good. If she failed now, Finch's hold on her would tighten until she broke. She forced her legs to move, stiff and unnatural. She returned to his table and, with trembling fingers, let the folded napkin slide onto the wood. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You forgot your tip." Her entire body trembled as she walked away, certain she had just leapt from a cliff with no parachute. Alex placed his hand over the napkin, feeling the linen against his skin. He knew without opening it that this was no ordinary tip, but a secret, perhaps even a plea. And as he slipped it into his jacket pocket, he understood that his quiet test of honesty had just become something far more dangerous. The evening rush began to fade, the clatter of plates subsiding into the softer rhythm of late service. Alex lingered at his table, finishing the last sip of coffee, the folded napkin burning like a brand in his pocket. Around him, diners laughed, toasting with their last glasses of wine, unaware that something extraordinary had just shifted inside the walls of the Gilded Steer. Emily moved quietly among the tables, carrying menus back to their stand, clearing plates with steady hands. On the surface, she was composed, the picture of professionalism. But inside, her heart beat so fast, it seemed the whole room must hear it. She had taken the risk. For the first time since Finch had trapped her, she had passed the truth into someone else's hands. At home in Dorchester, her son Danny was asleep on the old sofa, his toy cars lined up neatly on the coffee table beside him. Emily thought of him constantly, even as she smiled at guests and wiped crumbs from linen tablecloths. He was the reason she endured the endless shifts, the cruel words, the fear that shadowed her every day. Danny's world was small doctor's visits, medicine bottles, bedtime stories whispered over the hum of a space heater, but his smile was bright enough to light her darkest hours. Danny had once asked her why she worked so late. "So you can get better, sweetheart," she had told him, brushing his hair back. "So one day, you can run in the park all afternoon without getting tired." He had nodded solemnly, too young to fully understand, but old enough to cling to her words like a promise. Tonight, though, Emily felt the promise wavering. If Finch found out about the napkin, there would be no job left, no paycheck, no way to keep Danny's medicine coming. She prayed Alex would understand the message, that he was more than he seemed. Something about him, his steady gaze, the way he had defended her with nothing more than a nod, made her believe he might. Across the dining room, Alex rose. He left no tip, only the exact amount owed, a signal she understood. The note was the tip. The currency had changed from dollars to truth. As he pulled on his jacket and left through the brass doors, Emily dared one last glance. He did not look back, but she felt in her bones that he had understood. Outside, the Boston night was cold and damp. Alex walked several blocks before leaning against a brick wall, pulling out the napkin. Under the yellow street lamp, the words glared at him. "They're watching you. The kitchen is not safe. Check the ledger in Finch's office. He's poisoning the supply chain." He read them twice, then again. This was no plea for help, no petty complaint. It was a declaration. If true, it was a cancer in his empire. If false, it was a dangerous trap. Either way, it was no longer just a game of testing honesty. He slid the napkin back into his pocket, his mind already shifting into the cold clarity of strategy. Back at the restaurant, Emily gathered her belongings in the staff room. The clock ticked past midnight. She pulled her coat tight and stepped out into the chill. The streets of Back Bay had grown quiet. Shop windows dark, only the distant sound of a passing trolley breaking the silence. She hurried toward the subway station, her breath rising in little clouds. At home, she unlocked the apartment door softly. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of a small lamp. Danny stirred on the couch, his blanket slipping off one shoulder. Emily tucked it back over him and kissed his forehead. He murmured something in his sleep, something about toy trains, and she smiled despite her exhaustion. She sat at the kitchen table, head in her hands, staring at the unpaid bills stacked in a neat pile. Each envelope was a weight pressing down on her chest. Tonight, she had gambled everything. The napkin was out there now. She could only hope it had landed in the hands of someone who would not let it die. The next afternoon, when Danny returned from school, he brought home a crumpled paper with a drawing. He had drawn 3 stick figures, himself, his mom, and a tall man with glasses. Emily's heart tightened as she looked at it. "Who's this?" she asked gently. Danny smiled, his front teeth missing. "That's the man from last night. He looks like Grandpa in my book. He was watching you. I think he's nice." Emily froze, her chest tightening. Danny had noticed him too. Children saw what adults often missed. She smoothed his hair and kissed the top of his head, but her mind was spinning. Grandpa. The word clung to her thoughts, strange and unsettling. Later that week, Danny and Emily walked through Boston Common. It was Saturday, and the leaves crunched beneath their shoes as a chilly breeze rattled the bare branches. Vendors sold hot cocoa. Families gathered for photographs with the holiday lights, and the smell of roasted peanuts drifted through the air. Emily tried to enjoy the moment, holding her son's hand, but her nerves were raw. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if Finch himself might appear among the crowd. They sat on a bench to rest. Danny dug into his backpack and pulled out a worn photograph he had been carrying a school assignment, had asked for family pictures, but he had none recent. Instead, he had slipped out an old snapshot Emily thought she had hidden. It was from her college years, before Danny was born. A younger Emily stood smiling with a tall man beside her. Danny held it up. "Mom, why don't we have any pictures of Grandpa?" Emily's breath caught. She reached for the photo, but Danny pulled it back, grinning. "This man looks like the one from the restaurant. Same eyes. You think maybe—" Her hand trembled as she took the picture gently. She had never told Danny much about his father. She had buried those years deep, raising him alone with what little strength she had. But now, looking at the photograph, her chest constricted. Could the stranger at table 32, the man who had ordered the Emperor's cut without blinking, be connected to her past? Danny leaned against her, his voice soft. "I wish I had a grandpa, like other kids." Emily kissed his hair, her throat tightening. "Me too, sweetheart," she whispered. She slipped the old photograph into her coat pocket, unaware that the man Danny had pointed out, the one with the same eyes, was already beginning to search for her truth. The napkin never left Alex's pocket that night. He returned to his penthouse, but the view of Boston glittering below held no comfort. He poured a drink and sat at the long oak table, staring at the folded linen square as though it were a live coal. For years, his secret excursions into the ordinary world had been private exercises, ways to remind himself of humanity beyond polished boardrooms. But this time, it was different. This time, someone had reached back. He unfolded the napkin again, tracing the hurried handwriting. "They're watching you. The kitchen is not safe. Check the ledger in Finch's office. He's poisoning the supply chain." It was not the voice of a petty grievance. It was written with fear, but also with courage. Whoever she was, she had risked everything to get this into his hands. Alex set the glass aside and reached for a burner phone he kept for such nights. Only one number was programmed into it. The line clicked twice before a voice answered. "Arthur Pendleton." "It's me," Alex said. Arthur had been with him for 20 years. Chief Operating Officer, loyal confidant, the man who could turn Alex's wild instincts into order. "You sound troubled," Arthur said. "I need information," Alex replied. He told him everything: the waitress, the order, Finch's hostility, and finally, the napkin. He read the words aloud, his voice low. Arthur was silent for a moment. "That's a serious accusation, Alex. If it's true, we're talking criminal charges, federal investigations. But if it's false..." "It's not false," Alex said sharply. I saw the fear in her eyes. "This isn't about a disgruntled employee. She's in danger." Arthur exhaled slowly. "What do you want me to do?" "Get me everything you can on Gregory Finch. Financial records, employment history, off the books, activity. No internal audit, he'll smell it. Use the same contractors we use in hostile acquisitions. And Arthur, make it fast." "You'll have it by morning," Arthur promised. Alex ended the call and leaned back, rubbing his temples. For years, he had built walls around himself, walls that money and power reinforced. But the look on that young woman's face had slipped past his defenses. She had trusted him with the truth, and for the first time in a long while, Alex felt the weight of responsibility that went deeper than quarterly earnings. By dawn, Arthur's report arrived in a secure file. Alex scrolled through the details. Finch's finances showed irregular payments from shell corporations, expenses that didn't match his salary. There were invoices from suppliers that did not exist in any legitimate registry. And then the most damning piece: connections to Westland Meats, a plant shut down months earlier for contamination. The phrase "poisoning the supply chain" was no metaphor. Finch had been funneling diseased meat into the restaurant group, masking it with falsified invoices, and pocketing the profits. It was reckless, criminal, and potentially catastrophic for Carter Holdings. Alex's jaw tightened as he scrolled further. There was more files of staff testimonies, whispers of intimidation, names of employees who had left suddenly under suspicious circumstances. And one note in particular caught his eye. Emily Johnson, waitress, previous community college records and accounting, single mother, no record of theft or misconduct. He stopped cold. Single mother, community college accounting. His memory tugged at something buried. Alex pressed his palms flat on the desk. He had known a woman named Sarah Johnson years ago, back when he was still climbing the first rungs of his empire. They had been close for a season, but when his ambitions pulled him across the country, he had let the relationship drift and then vanish. He had always assumed she had gone on with her life, married, raised a family. He had never looked back. Now the name Johnson stared at him from the file, tethered to the young woman with brown eyes and worn shoes. A cold thought slid into his chest. Could she be Sarah's daughter? Could she be his? He rose and paced the room. The thought impossible, yet relentless. The timing fit. Emily looked to be in her mid-20s. Sarah had been in Boston around that time. Alex's breath caught as the pieces aligned, one by one. But there was no proof yet. And proof mattered. Later that afternoon, Alex called Arthur again. "I need everything on Emily Johnson. Background, family history, school, residence. Be discreet." "Of course," Arthur said. "But Alex, if you're thinking what I think you are, be careful." Alex ended the call without reply. He wasn't ready to voice it, not even to Arthur. But inside, a storm was rising. Meanwhile, Emily sat at her kitchen table in Dorchester, watching Danny draw with colored pencils. He hummed softly, making little car noises as he sketched. She tried to smile, but her hands trembled around the coffee mug. She didn't know if the stranger at table 32 had read the napkin or if he had dismissed it as nonsense. She didn't know if tomorrow Finch would corner her again, doubling the threats. Danny looked up, holding out a drawing. "Mom, look! It's us!" She took it gently. 3 stick figures. Emily, Danny, and a taller man standing beside them. Her chest tightened. "Who's this?" she asked softly. "That's the man from the restaurant," Danny said, grinning. "The one with the kind eyes. It looks like a grandpa." Emily swallowed hard, brushing her thumb across the paper. She wanted to tell him it was nothing, that he was imagining things. But something deep inside her stirred, something she had locked away long ago. That night, long after Danny had gone to sleep, she pulled out an old shoebox from the closet. Inside were scraps of her past photographs, ticket stubs, letters never sent. At the bottom lay a picture she had almost forgotten, herself as a teenager, standing with her mother, Sarah. Beside Sarah was a tall young man with strong shoulders and dark hair. His smile was faint, but his eyes, those eyes, were unmistakable. Emily's hand trembled as she held the photograph. She remembered asking her mother once, when she was small, who her father was. Sarah had only said, "He had dreams too big for a small town." And that was all. Now, staring at the photo, Emily felt her breath hitch. The man's eyes were the same eyes she had seen last night across table 32. Emily dropped the photograph back into the box, her heart pounding. She didn't want to believe it, but the truth pressed closer with every beat. The stranger at the Gilded Steer, the man who had held her gaze with quiet strength, might not be a stranger at all. The city awoke to a gray Boston morning, the kind where clouds pressed low over the Charles River and the air smelled faintly of rain. In his penthouse, Alex Carter had not slept much. The photograph Arthur's investigators had uncovered a young Sarah Johnson with him decades ago. Holding a child who could only have been Emily lay on the desk in front of him. Proof. No longer speculation, no longer whispers of resemblance. Proof that Emily was his daughter. He sat for hours, staring at the photograph, trying to summon the right memories. He remembered Sarah's laughter, her stubborn streak, the way she challenged his certainty when he was a young man full of ambition. He had left her behind, chasing towers of glass and steel, promising himself he would come back. But he never did. And now, the debt of that choice had come full circle, standing in the form of a young woman in a faded apron, trapped under the thumb of a corrupt manager. Arthur called mid-morning. "I've dug deeper. Finch is worse than we thought. Money laundering, falsified invoices, ties to organized crime. And Alex," his voice softened, "we confirmed Emily Johnson's parentage. She's Sarah's daughter, which means—" "I know," Alex interrupted, his throat tightening. "She's mine." Silence stretched across the line. Arthur finally spoke again, gently. "What do you want to do?" Alex rose from his chair, staring out at the city skyline. "I want justice, for her, for Danny, and I want to make this right." That evening, Alex dressed not as the wanderer in thrift store clothes, but not fully as the billionaire either. He chose something simple, a dark wool coat, clean but understated. He needed to walk into the fire, not as a titan, but as a father. He returned to the Gilded Steer just as the dinner rush began. The brass doors swung open to the same fragrance of charred steaks and aged wine. Patrons in evening wear filled the room, but Alex's eyes found Emily instantly. She moved between tables, carrying plates with practiced grace, though her eyes betrayed the storm within. When she approached him, recognition flickered. "You're back," she whispered. "Yes," Alex said softly. "I needed to." Her hands trembled as she poured water into his glass. You read it?" "I did," he replied, his gaze steady. "And I believe you." Her breath hitched. For weeks, she had carried fear like a stone in her chest. Now, for the first time, it felt lighter. But Finch was watching. From across the room, the manager's eyes narrowed, his mouth curling into a sneer. He moved toward them, his steps sharp, his posture radiating authority. "Vance," Finch snapped, his voice dripping with false cheer. "A word." Emily froze. Alex saw the fear in her shoulders, the way her chin dipped. But before she could obey, Alex spoke. "Actually, she's taking my order." Finch turned to him, his smile brittle. "Sir, I'm the manager. I just need a quick moment with my employee." Alex set his menu down deliberately. "You'll have your moment later. Right now, I'd like to finish my conversation." For the first time, Finch faltered. Something about the calm steel in Alex's voice unsettled him. He muttered something under his breath and retreated to the bar, though his eyes never left them. Emily looked at Alex, wide-eyed. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered. He considered telling her the truth right then, that he was her father, that he had failed her before and would not fail her again. But the words lodged in his throat. It was not the time. Not yet. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. That night, long after the restaurant closed, Alex and Arthur met in a quiet cafe in Cambridge. Arthur slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of Finch's falsified invoices, financial transfers, and, most damning of all, hidden video files Finch had kept as blackmail. In the shaky footage, Emily appeared, cornered in his office, her voice trembling as Finch threatened her, invoking Danny's health as leverage. Alex's fist clenched around the folder. Fury rose in him, hot and unfamiliar. Not the controlled anger of a boardroom, but the raw, protective fury of a father. Arthur watched him quietly. "We can take this to the authorities. The FBI will act fast. But Alex, if you want Emily safe, you need to handle this carefully. Finch will lash out if he suspects." Alex nodded slowly. "Then we need to be ahead of him. Tomorrow we move." Meanwhile, Emily returned home to find Danny asleep with his sketchbook open. She lifted it gently and saw his latest drawing. Himself, Emily, and the tall man again, all three holding hands beneath the sun. She sat on the edge of the couch, tears welling. Danny had drawn what she had never dared to imagine a family complete. The next day, Emily arrived at work with dread pressing in her chest. Finch called her into his office before her shift. The blinds were half closed, casting harsh stripes of light across the desk. He leaned back in his chair, his voice a low purr. "You think I don't notice? The way you've been looking at that man? The way he looks at you? Be careful, Emily. You don't want to make your situation worse." Her hands balled into fists at her sides. For months, she had bowed to his threats, endured his cruelty. But last night's conversation had planted a seed of courage. She lifted her chin. "Maybe one day, Mr. Finch, you won't have the power you think you do." His smile thinned into a sneer. "Careful, girl." She left the office trembling, but inside, something had shifted. She was no longer entirely afraid. Someone had seen her, believed her, and that made all the difference. That evening, as the restaurant buzzed with another dinner rush, Alex sat again at table 32, watching, waiting. He had prepared everything with Arthur and the authorities. The trap was ready to close. But before it did, he knew there was one truth left to speak. Emily carried a tray of wine glasses past his table. Alex looked up at her, the photograph of Sarah heavy in his pocket. His throat tightened as he whispered to himself words he had not spoken aloud in decades. "She's my daughter." The following day dawned brighter, a pale sun breaking through the November clouds. But for Alex, the light carried no warmth. He spent the morning in meetings with Arthur and federal investigators, going over the evidence once more. The ledger, the forged invoices, the video files of Finch's threats, everything was ready. Yet the documents and strategies felt secondary. What pressed hardest against his chest was not the corruption or the risk to his company, but the truth he now carried. Emily was his daughter. Arthur saw it in his face. "You've led hostile takeovers, Alex. You've faced senators and rivals. But this is different." Alex rubbed his temple. "It's not just about the company anymore. She's family. She doesn't even know it. And when this breaks, she'll be standing in the middle of it all." Arthur nodded, his voice soft. "Then be sure she knows you're on her side." By late morning, 2 black SUVs pulled up in front of the Gilded Steer. Their tinted windows reflected the street, but inside sat agents prepared to execute a warrant. Alex stepped out, flanked by Arthur, his expression solemn. He was not Jim the Wanderer now. He was Alexander Carter, the man behind the empire, and he was coming for the truth. Inside the restaurant, the staff froze. Gregory Finch had been expecting a celebrity perhaps, or a political figure. He had not been expecting the reclusive owner of Carter Holdings himself. His practiced smile slipped, replaced by shock as Alex walked past the hostess stand without a word. "Mr. Carter," Finch stammered, his voice thick. I didn't realize you were—" Alex cut him off with a glance. "We have business to discuss," the staff whispered among themselves, eyes darting between the billionaire and their manager. Emily stood near the host station, menus clutched to her chest, her face pale. Her first thought was that she would be fired, that her secret had reached the worst possible hands. But then Alex's gaze found hers. And instead of cold dismissal, she saw something she had never expected. Recognition, gentleness, almost sorrow. "Emily," he said quietly, "would you come with us?" Her knees nearly buckled. She followed as they moved into Finch's office, her heart pounding against her ribs. Inside, Arthur set a tablet on the desk, pulling up files with clinical precision. "Mr. Finch, we know everything," Arthur said, his voice sharp. "The fraudulent invoices, the payments from Westland Meats, the contaminated supply chain. And these," he tapped, revealing video stills of Finch leaning over Emily, his face twisted with threats. "These are enough to put you away for a very long time." Finch's face drained of color. He sputtered. She helped. She cooked the books. Ask her." Emily gasped. "That's a lie." Alex's voice dropped, cold and furious. "You blackmailed her. You used her son's health against her, and that is something I will never forgive." The agent stepped forward, producing handcuffs. Finch's protest dissolved into incoherent pleas as they pinned his hands behind his back. The sight of his downfall sent a ripple through the staff, gathered outside the door. Emily stood trembling, clutching the back of a chair for balance. "My son," she whispered, her voice breaking. Alex turned to her, his expression softening. "Danny is safe. I'll make sure of it." Her eyes widened. "How do you know his name?" The room grew still. Arthur glanced at Alex, but said nothing. Alex drew in a deep breath, the photograph of Sarah still heavy in his pocket. "Because I knew your mother," he said gently, "many years ago, and because you're my daughter." Emily stared at him, stunned, her lips parting but no sound escaping. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. All the questions she had buried for years, all the pieces of her past that had never fit together, suddenly aligned. Her voice was barely a whisper. You left." Alex's throat tightened. "Yes, and it's the greatest regret of my life. But I'm here now. And I will not leave again." Tears blurred her vision. She turned away, overwhelmed, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face. For years, she had stood alone, fighting battles with nothing but grit and exhaustion. And now, in a single moment, she was no longer alone. The agents led Finch out of the office, past the stunned staff, his head bowed. Silence hung heavy in his wake. Alex stepped closer to Emily, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "I want to help you. I want to help Danny. I want to be the father I should have been all along." Emily lowered her hands slowly, her eyes red, her voice fragile. "How can I trust you? How do I know you won't disappear again?" Alex swallowed hard, searching her gaze. "Because this time, I'm not running toward ambition. I'm running toward family." For the first time in decades, his words were not calculated, not strategic. They were simply true. Emily's lips trembled. She wanted to believe him. She wanted Danny to have the grandfather he had drawn in his notebooks, the family he dreamed of. But the wounds of abandonment did not heal in a moment. Still, something inside her shifted. She nodded once, slowly, as though allowing herself to take the first fragile step. Outside the office, the staff whispered, the hum of the restaurant subdued. No one knew what this revelation meant. Not yet. But for Alex and Emily, the path forward was clear. It would not be easy, but it would begin now. Emily stood frozen, her chest heaving, the word daughter echoing in her ears. And as she looked into Alex's eyes that mirrored her own, she realized her life would never be the same again. The next morning broke crisp and clear, the November air tinged with the promise of winter. News traveled quickly. Within hours of Gregory Finch's arrest, headlines spread across Boston. Manager of upscale restaurant charged in supply chain fraud. But behind the headlines was a quieter, more intimate story, one of family rediscovered, of debts long overdue finally being paid. Emily woke with Danny curled against her side, his small body radiating warmth in the drafty apartment. For the first time in years, she felt hope pressing against the cracks of her fear. The night before had been overwhelming, Finch in handcuffs, Alex revealing the truth, her own heart twisting with betrayal and longing. She had hardly slept, yet as she stroked Danny's hair, she felt strength returning. Downstairs, a knock sounded on the door. Emily hesitated, pulling on a sweater, her stomach tightening. When she opened it, Alex stood there. He wasn't in a tailored suit this time, nor in shabby clothes from a thrift shop. He wore a simple coat, the kind any father might wear on a Saturday morning. In his hand was a paper bag from a neighborhood diner. The smell of bacon and pancakes drifted out. "I thought," Alex said softly, "maybe we could have breakfast together, like a family. Danny peeked around his mother's legs, his eyes wide. "It's the man from the restaurant!" he exclaimed. Emily's throat tightened, but she stepped aside. Alex entered the apartment, the sight of peeling paint and worn furniture hitting him harder than any boardroom defeat. He set the bag on the table, pulling out styrofoam boxes. "Hope you like pancakes," he said gently. Danny grinned. "With syrup?" "Of course." Alex smiled, handing him a packet. Emily sat across the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. For a few minutes, the room filled only with the sounds of forks scraping plates and Danny's delighted chatter. Alex watched his grandson with quiet wonder, as if memorizing every expression. But then his gaze shifted to Emily. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything," he said quietly, "but I want to make this right. I want to be part of your lives. I can help with the bills, the doctors, the future, not as charity, but as family." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "You left us," she whispered. "You left Mom, and you never came back. How can I trust you now?" Alex's shoulders sagged, the weight of regret pressing down. "Because I've learned," he said softly, "all the money, the buildings, the power, it means nothing if you can't look your own daughter in the eye. I can't undo the past, but I can be here now. For you, for Danny." Silence stretched. Danny, sensing the heaviness, looked between them. "Mom?" he asked softly. "Can he stay?" Emily swallowed hard, her heart aching. She saw the truth in Alex's eyes, raw, unguarded, stripped of all armor. For years, she had carried her battles alone. For Danny's sake, for her own weary heart, perhaps it was time to stop. Later that week, Emily walked into the Gilded Steer not as a waitress, but as a guest. The staff greeted her with respect, whispers following her through the room. Finch was gone, the corruption rooted out, and the restaurant was under new oversight. At table 32, the same battered corner where it had all begun, Alex waited. Beside him sat Arthur, his ever-loyal confidant, papers spread neatly across the table. "Emily," Alex said as she approached, "this is yours." He pushed forward a document. "A trust fund for Danny's medical care, fully covered for life. And this," he slid another page toward her, "a new position, Director of Ethical Oversight for Carter Holdings. I want you to ensure that no one in my company ever suffers what you endured. You'll answer directly to me." Emily's hands trembled as she read. "I don't know if I'm qualified." "You are," Alex said firmly. "You saw injustice, and you acted, even when it risked everything. That is integrity, and integrity is what this company needs." Her eyes blurred with tears. For years, she had been just a waitress, dismissed and overlooked. Now, she was being offered not just security, but purpose. Arthur smiled gently. "Sometimes the right person isn't the one with the longest resume, but the one with the strongest heart." Emily looked at her father, her voice breaking. "Yes, I'll do it." Weeks later, as December snow fell over Boston, a small ceremony was held at the company headquarters. Emily stood beside Alex, her hand resting on Danny's shoulder, as they announced the creation of the Sarah Johnson Foundation. Named for the mother Emily had lost and the woman Alex had once loved, the foundation would provide medical and financial support for families in crisis, ensuring no parent would ever face the choices Emily had been forced to make alone. Reporters asked questions, cameras flashed, but for Alex, the moment was not about publicity. It was about redemption. As he looked at Emily and Danny, he knew he had finally found what had been missing all along. That evening, they walked together through Boston Common, the Christmas lights twinkling above. Danny skipped ahead, his laughter echoing through the cold air. Emily walked beside her father, still cautious, still healing, but no longer alone. Alex inhaled deeply, the crisp winter air filling his lungs. For the first time in decades, he felt whole. He had set out seeking honesty, testing strangers to find something real. In the end, what he found was family. Emily reached for Danny's hand, and Alex took her other. Together they walked beneath the glowing lights, three figures bound not by wealth or circumstance, but by love rediscovered. And in that moment, Alex knew the truth. Redemption was possible, and the strength of family could heal even the deepest wounds. There is a certain silence that follows the end of a storm, not the silence of emptiness, but the quiet that comes when a burden has been lifted, when the air feels lighter and every breath carries the promise of renewal. That is the silence Emily felt as she walked with her father under the Boston lights. And it is the silence Alex finally allowed himself to hear after decades of noise, ambition, and regret. If this story touched your heart, I invite you, just as neighbors might ask on a porch swing, to press the number 1 inch, the comments. And if it left you with questions or thoughts you'd like to share, press the number 0, because your voice matters here. What can we take with us from their journey? That love, even delayed, still has the power to mend. That redemption is not about erasing mistakes, but about showing up, finally, for the people who needed us all along. Alex thought wealth would insulate him from loneliness, but it was the courage of a young waitress and the innocent drawings of a child that cracked the armor around his heart. Emily, who once carried her world alone, discovered that family can return in the most unexpected form. And Danny, whose quiet wish for a grandfather seemed like nothing more than a child's dream, proved that sometimes a child's hope is the truest compass of all. In every life, there are doors left closed, apologies never spoken, and loved ones we have drifted from. But this story reminds us that it is never too late to knock on those doors, never too late to bend down to a child's level and listen, never too late to say, "I am here now." Just as Alex's fortune could not protect him from loneliness, our own possessions will never shield us from the hunger for connection. What matters, in the end, is not the size of our bank account, but the depth of our kindness. Perhaps the lesson is as simple as this: unconditional love can change the course of a life. Everyone deserves to be seen, to be cared for, and to belong to a family. Compassion outweighs wealth. Dignity is more valuable than prestige. And when we dare to give someone a chance, even a weary waitress at the worst table in the house, we may discover a light brighter than any fortune. Happiness does not arrive in the form of stock certificates or headlines. It comes quietly, when we learn to live not for ourselves, but for others. Think of it this way, like the steady lamp glowing in a kitchen window on a winter's night. One small act of kindness can guide us safely through the darkest stretches of the road. We may never know how far its light will travel, but to someone lost in the shadows, it might mean everything. So, as this story comes to a close, I encourage you to let it linger a while. Reflect on your own journey, on the bridges you might rebuild, on the words you still have time to say. And if this story touched you, share it with a friend, the way we once shared letters or recipes across a fence line, as a way of reminding one another that good people still exist, that family still heals, and that redemption is always within reach. In the end, Alex, Emily, and Danny remind us of something we often forget, that the truest wealth is not found in what we own, but in who walks beside us when the night grows cold. And just maybe, when we carry that lesson with us, the quiet after the storm can become the sweetest sound we'll ever know.